Hello, welcome to Encounters. My guest today is Professor Barbie Zelizer. She is the chair of the Raymond Williams position at the University of Pennsylvania in the Annenberg School for Communication in Philadelphia. And she is also the president of the International Communication Association, ICA, which is one of the prestigious associations in our field. She is, by the way, also a prolific writer. She has authored a number of books and articles, but is also the editor of, again, one of the important journals called Journalism, so-called SAGE journal. But Professor Zelizer grew up and studied in Israel, and then moved to the US, and maybe her experience in that part of the world might be of interest to our viewers and also for the theme which we are trying to address today, journalism and or for social change. So there are relationships which could be explored, and relationships which are not always very obvious or unidimensional. I hope that we can get into that kind of analysis or discussion at a later stage. But let me start with a quote from one of the articles Professor Zelizer produced in 2007, which got published in the Brazilian Journalism Review journal. And it states as, although journalism has been around for as long as publics have needed mediated information about the larger world, journalism itself has experienced an uneven and spotty existence with the world. And she continues with a couple of questions, one of them being, where would history be without journalism? It's an important question to consider. But my question to you now is, where would social change be without journalism?
Thank you, Jan, and thank you for having me here. I think that the question of social change and journalism has been built into our assumptions, our subjunctive assumptions about what it is we hope journalism can do. Mm-hmm. For a very long time, we've assumed and desired a journalism that is able to affect social change. And the assumption that at some level journalism can impact the body politic, can have influence in the world, is embedded in our expectations of what journalism can be on the ground. But I would argue that that is a somewhat problematic and perhaps premature assumption.
Why problematic?
Problematic because I don't think that journalism can affect social change the way we want it to be, to do. And I think that the distinctions between our expectations and our desires and what we actually find on the ground, I feel grows larger every day. Mm-hmm.
So what would be the ideal stage of journalism in your opinion?
Well, the question, I think, if I could reframe it, would be what needs to change about journalism in order that it might be able to affect social change more aggressively. And I think that there are four aspects of journalism's sense of itself, of the public's understanding of journalism, and of journalism scholars' abilities to forward and advance certain understandings of how journalism works. That includes journalism and journalists needing a greater self-awareness of what it is they do. They need a more nuanced, fuller, more profound self-knowledge about how journalism works, what makes it work better in certain circumstances, what makes it work less well in others. Journalism and journalists need to be more proactive. I think that there is an enormous and troubling degree of reactivity going on in journalism. The laments in public discourse are always about journalism's latest failing, its latest failure, its latest defect, its latest inability to do something that somebody wants it to do. And so journalism is always kind of running the gauntlet, trying to keep up with whatever expectations are being thrown at it without really figuring out at the get-go what it is that journalists and journalism need to be doing differently. Journalists need to be more reflexive. They need to understand far more carefully and far more closely what it is they do. And journalism scholars play a critical part in helping them understand not only the ways in which journalism links up with other forces and other institutional fields, and by that I mean politics, economics, religion, culture, education.
Is that what you mean by more reflective, more contextual in its analysis?
More thoughtful, more thoughtful, more contextual, less confident. That may seem paradoxical, but I think that journalism has long been a bastion of positivist thinking, which has certainly pushed it in certain directions, but I think creates problems about its lack of understanding more fully, both in terms of other developments at the same time, as well as developments earlier in time, earlier in history. So, and one fourth point, if I may, is that journalists and journalism need to be more transparent. They need to be far more upfront about what it is they can do and can't do, and to admit when they don't have the solutions rather than offer solutions that clearly the public is finding are at some level falling short of what it is they want to hear.
Okay, so let's deconstruct the 4 points you made, and maybe we could continue with the last one. Why more transparency? Why the need for being more open and acknowledging its mistakes and its failures, I guess?
Because much of journalism gets played out behind the scenes. A journalist goes, and I say this as a former journalist. You said that I had lived for many years in the Middle East. I worked as a reporter. I worked for Reuters in the wire services in a domain that is probably among the best for learning the craft of journalism. Much of what journalists give us as a record of events beyond our grasp is not verifiable. It depends on public trust. It depends on a public willing to look at a journalist and what he or she has produced as a record and say, I believe that. And so if the journalist doesn't give the public as many cues of how they got to that particular record as possible, then there's nothing to really push a trust in journalism as an institution. And that's the reason I believe that journalists rank near the bottom of most lists of those groups and individuals and professions that people trust. People simply do not have confidence in journalism anymore.
But implicit in what you're arguing now is severe critique on types of, let's call it American journalism, where there's still that kind of assumption that there is a way to get to the truth, an objective way to arrive at a proper assessment of what has happened, etc.
Yes, absolutely. I think that objectivity is one of the unsung villains of journalism, and I think that the persistent belief and lingering adherence to tenets of objectivity does more to provide kind of critical failures for journalism than it does to produce any kind of good journalistic record keeping.
Okay, but then let's move to the direction of what is good journalism. I'm sure that you have some examples in mind.
Well, first of all, I think that journalists have to be clear about what it is they're offering. Journalists have to be partial about what they're offering. Journalists have to be reflective about what they're offering. And the audience needs to understand that no one journalistic account can ever give a full record of what it is that's happening. I think that we need to be changing what I would call journalistic literacy in this country and elsewhere in the world, media literacy, if you will, the capacity of the public to recognize that if they do not aggressively seek out multiple sources of information for any given story, then they're not doing their part as citizens. And I think that what we have done repeatedly and erroneously is shifted the onus for providing a record of events only onto journalism and left the public as a kind of dummy recipient of the record as it should be provided to them. no one journalist can provide everything, and no one news organization can provide everything.
Yes, I take that as a good point, and I also agree that we have to put some responsibility at the level of the consumer or the viewer or the watcher of programs. But in a country and a context like the United States, where in my opinion the variety of different opinions, not media institutions, but opinions being presented through those media is quite limited. It's all driven towards the mainstream, towards the middle way. How can you become a more informed person in such an environment?
First of all, I disagree. I don't think that there is a limitation or a restricted field of opinions. I think that the opinions are farther flung than where people normally look. Particularly in the online mediated environment that we live in today, people can search for information as far from the mainstream as they want to go. And the question is, do they know how to do that? Mm-hmm. Will they do that? If they know how to do that, will they take the time? I don't think that the opinions are not available. I think that they're not in the first record. But I think that we need to teach the public to look beyond the first record. I regularly tell my students that they need to not only look at U.S. news, they need to look at news in the Middle East, they need to look at news in Europe, they need to look at sources for news in Latin America, in Africa, just because every glimpse is going to offer a different refraction of the same event. And the fact that we don't do this actively, I think, has worked really against having the kind of reasoned and informed body politic that we could have, particularly in this country.
But now you are looking at the situation as if people have a full day to their availability of doing this or becoming a journalist themselves, in other words, while most of the people are limited in the time they can spend on their search for some understanding of what's happening, and they are limited to what I would call the mainstream media, mainly TV news, rather than what's available on internet. And then the question in addition to that still remains, is there not too much noise on the internet so that you never get or you have difficulties in getting to the right pieces of information?
I'm a news junkie. So in a perfect world, I want everybody to be a news junkie just like me. Barring that, again, this comes down to search mechanisms. It comes down to teaching people how to navigate the web. It comes down to teaching people how to shortcut their search so that they can find the kinds of information that they want. So I don't think that it's a question of time. I think that people are regularly surfing the web. They're surfing the web for different kinds of information, and I think that what we need to do, what I feel I need to do as a journalism scholar, is make it important enough, make it interesting enough for people to look to the web in order to find that kind of information easily.
Okay, so if we assume that everybody has the availability in time, but also in resources and technological capacity to do that, then you might get to the point that indeed they have a variety of information to their availability, which might lead to a more reflective way of looking at problems and a multi-dimensional kind of assessment of what the problem is about. And that definitely is going to be more helpful for all of us to understand what's happening in the world. But even then, and now we come to the second part of the issue, in what way is this going to influence or assist us in our attempt to also contribute to social change, so to speak?
Well, again, I think that it's preliminary to being able to contribute to social change. I think that it's critical that if we don't get these kinds of circumstances attended to, we're never going to get to social change. Social change means many things.
It's just like journalism.
It is just like journalism. But social change can range from the most circumspect, discrete, small engagement with somebody that a journalist covers, to the largest policy issue out there. The idea that journalists have a role to play, I think, is a sound one, but it is not being realized. And so until we can deal with these circumstances that I believe are have fallen into disrepair as we have moved on in our nonetheless steadfast assumption that journalists can affect social change, what we have is a growing distinction between what we want and what we have on the ground.
Right. And how to bridge that?
And how to bridge it, yeah.
Any clues?
Are you asking me how to bridge it? I think that we need, as I said, I think that we need to be far more strident about figuring out how to get the journalism we need. I think we need to be far more strident in our journalism scholarship about using research and using intellectual argument as a way to bring journalists into a different kind of engagement with the world that is longer in duration, it's fuller in its understanding of context, it is more proactive in terms of what it can anticipate might come into play. And I think we need to force the kinds of circumstances that will allow and invite the public to get more involved. I think that technologically we have the landscape to do this. The fact that we have not done this means that for me at some level we're not thinking as creatively as we can about how social change really could take shape through the various digital channels that we have available today.
But very crucial in everything you are advocating is the concept of a new type of education, a new type of literacy. Yes. How would you configure that? How would you see this in your own work and in your own activities as a professor? How to change an education system which is not up to that level of necessity, so to speak?
Well, I think this has to change all the way down into the grade schools. I don't think that this is a university issue. I think this is a grade school and secondary school educational issue, and that is a national imperative. If Barack Obama were asking me what I think should be on his agenda, I would say media literacy, absolutely, and media literacy that I think is cognizant of and receptive to a bottoms-up understanding of how practices are changing. I have 3 kids. As I said, I'm a news junkie. I have every newspaper, every journal cluttering up my house that one could want. And my kids don't touch it. They don't touch any of the old media, but they know what is going on in the news world because they are on the web all the time. And I think that we've waited too long to recognize those kinds of transformations in the mediated environment, to the extent that both journalists and in many places, not all, but in many places journalism scholars are behind the pacing in understanding really what media literacy looks like for a 12-year-old today, and it looks very different than it looked when you or I were 12-year-old.
Right. No, I fully agree. I also have kids, and they engage with media in totally different ways than I do, and they may also come up with perspectives on issues different or in line with my own appreciation. So the forms of engagement with the sources of information, the technologies may be different, but that doesn't really mean that the conclusions or the outcomes always have to be different. But nevertheless, it will need to be addressed, as you said, in a contextual, in a complicated setting of where to start and where to give the first impetus for this kind of change. The school system might be a good starting point, but if I may link it once again to journalism, we are also faced with journalism schools, journalism programs. Some of them are very professional and skills-based, others are much more academic in their assessments. Any advice here?
Well, again, I think that what we need to be doing is creating a far more porous and open and receptive environment in our journalism schools. If I can just segue, my own research, for instance, is very active in looking at images, news images in times of crisis. And what I am finding is that the ways in which images are used in the news reflect a profoundly insufficient set of clear standards for using images. And yet, in times of crisis, whether it's after natural disaster, war, terrorism, there is a turn to the visual in news whereby pictures become a larger part of the news record than in normal times. So that what we have is a gravitation toward one kind of tool for news relay that we haven't really thought out. We haven't thought out how it works, we haven't thought out when it works, who it works on, and in which ways. And that, to me, is also a question of literacy.
Right.
But it's a question of literacy among journalists. It's a question of literacy among journalism educators. And I think we need to be doing a more aggressive job at making the landscape as complicated as journalism itself deserves.
Right. I think that you are hinting now at a need for more audiovisual literacy, right?
Yes,
and
absolutely.
that's definitely not being taught in the way it should be, given that we are still coming from a more traditional kind of literacy format. But if I may link that again to one of the things which journalists are forced to do these days, the multi-skilling, the multi-activities they are forced to produce, not only a written piece for a newspaper, but a radio report, a TV broadcast, and then sometimes together, sometimes afterwards, put all of that on a blog or online. They hardly have the time to do all of this in a very professional and reflective way. They are just basically meeting deadlines. So there is a need for a reorganization of all of this at the level of the work floor. But given that the future is uncertain for many of them, how can they
Well,
adjust
again,
to that?
I think we need to be creative. Michael Schudson and Len Downey recently produced a report in which they argue that what we should be doing is we should be taking a more active or using more actively students in journalism schools to kind of provide a background environment for providing some of the coverage that we may not be getting from news organizations. And I think that that's not such a bad idea. I mean, I think that we can be thinking more broadly. If news organizations are faced with the cost cutting that we know that they're all laboring under today, how can we create circumstances for more thoughtful engagement with public events? And there are other fields that have done that kind of backtracking and moved into different groups, different kinds of practices as a way of kind of buttressing what goes on in the front of the field. And I think that journalism certainly could be doing the same.
Okay, there's a lot of challenges put in front of us here, not only for journalists, but also for us as general viewers and consumers of media. And in the end, what I hear you saying is we should all become journalists, right?
Not such a bad idea.
Thanks, Professor Zelizer, for your input, and thank you for your interest.